For weeks now, analysts and commentators have been making a bold prediction that the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran could finally bring down the Islamic Republic. Iran's military infrastructure has taken major damage. Its supreme leader is dead, and the country is under intense economic and military pressure. To many observers, the conclusion seems obvious. Surely this is the moment when the regime collapses. But there is a problem with that theory. History suggests the opposite may be true. Despite everything that has happened, the Iranian regime is far more likely to survive than most people think. In fact, our baseline assessment is that there is roughly an 80% chance the Islamic Republic survives both the war and the rest of 2026. So today, we're going to look at why the regime is still standing, what could actually bring it down, and what a collapse would really look like if it happened. Because the reality is much more complicated than the headlines suggest. Section 1. Why the regime is still standing. To understand why the regime hasn't collapsed, you have to understand how Iran's political system actually works. It is not a simple dictatorship. Iran's system is layered and complex. It combines religious authority, elected institutions, and powerful security organizations. At the center of this system sits one of the most influential institutions in the country, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, often called the IRGC. The IRGC is not just a military force. Over the past 4 decades, it has built a massive economic and political network. It controls companies, infrastructure projects, energy interests, and media organizations. Its influence stretches across the government and deep into the Iranian economy. Many senior politicians, clerics, and bureaucrats are connected to this system. For them, the survival of the regime is not just ideological, it is personal. Their power, wealth, and security are tied directly to the survival of the Islamic Republic, which means that even when the country is under intense external pressure, powerful incentives exist for the elite to stick together. That kind of system is far harder to dismantle than many outsiders assume. Section 2. The regime still controls the guns. There is another factor that matters even more. The regime still controls the coercive apparatus of the state. The IRGC, together with the Basij militia, fields well over 1 million personnel. These forces have spent decades proving 2 things. First, they are loyal to the regime. Second, they are willing to use violence against protest movements. Iranian leadership has never hesitated to suppress demonstrations. We saw it during the protests of 2009, again in 2019, and again during the nationwide protests in 2022. Each time the state used force to restore control. That pattern matters, because history shows that regimes rarely fall simply because they are unpopular. They fall when the security forces stop defending them. And so far there is no clear evidence of that happening in Iran. As long as the security apparatus remains unified, the regime retains a decisive advantage over any protest movement. Section 3. The most likely path to collapse. That does not mean collapse is impossible. It just means the trigger would probably look different than many people expect. The most plausible scenario would involve a nationwide uprising. Iran's economic situation is already extremely fragile. Years of sanctions have weakened the economy. The war is damaging infrastructure, and reconstruction will be expensive. On top of that, the country faces long-term structural problems: water shortages, energy instability, and declining living standards. Public frustration with the regime is already very high, and the leadership transition may make things worse. Following the death of Ali Khamenei, power is expected to shift to his son, Mojtaba Khamenei. For many Iranians, that transition reinforces the perception that the system is becoming hereditary and closed to reform, which means protests are likely. But protests alone rarely bring down entrenched governments. For a movement to succeed, 3 things usually need to happen. First, demonstrators need stronger organization. Second, they often require some level of outside support. And third, most importantly, defections must occur within the security forces. Without cracks inside the regime's coercive apparatus, the regime still holds the upper hand. Section 4. The temptation of foreign intervention. External actors could try to tip the balance. Earlier this year, Donald Trump pledged support for Iranian protesters. That support could take several forms: providing communication tools, helping activists organize, or even covert material assistance. But this approach carries serious risks. From Tehran's perspective, direct foreign backing for protests would look like an attempt at regime change, and the likely response would be escalation. That escalation could include attacks on regional energy infrastructure, or renewed attempts to disrupt shipping through one of the world's most important energy routes, the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of global oil supply passes through that narrow waterway. Any major disruption there could send energy prices sharply higher. For Washington, that risk could limit how far support for Iranian protest movements goes. Section 5. A more subtle risk: elite infighting. Another potential pressure point lies inside the regime itself. For decades, Ali Khamenei played a crucial role behind the scenes. He acted as the ultimate mediator between competing factions inside Iran's political system. Clerics, military leaders, technocrats, politicians. When conflicts emerged, Khamenei often settled them. His successor may not have that same authority. Figures such as Ali Larijani and Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf still command significant influence, which means power could become more fragmented. Factional competition is normal in Iranian politics, but during a crisis, that competition can slow decision-making and create instability. It probably would not collapse the regime overnight, but it could gradually weaken the system over time. Section 6. The wild card: ethnic insurgencies. There is one more factor worth watching. Iran is a multi-ethnic country, and some regions have long histories of armed resistance against the state. In the northwest, Kurdish groups have fought the government for decades. In the southeast, Baloch militant organizations operate along the border with Pakistan. These movements already exist, and in theory, external powers could support them. But even with outside assistance, their ability to threaten the regime nationally would probably remain limited. Most of their influence is concentrated in specific border regions. Section 7. What collapse would actually look like. If the regime did collapse, the outcome might not look like the democratic transition many people imagine. A more likely scenario could resemble the early stages of the Syrian civil war. State institutions could fracture. Armed factions could emerge from pieces of the military and security services. Separatist regions might become long-term insurgent zones. Refugee flows could surge into neighboring countries like Turkey, and instability could spread across the Persian Gulf. Energy infrastructure and shipping lanes could become targets for armed groups. That would create long-lasting disruption around the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most important energy choke points. Conclusion. The Iranian regime has taken serious blows, but unpopular governments do not collapse simply because they are under pressure. They collapse when the institutions that defend them begin to fracture. And so far, there is little evidence that has happened in Iran, which means that despite the war, despite the protests, and despite the damage it has taken, the Islamic Republic may still prove far more resilient than many people expect.